They often say that a family is built on a foundation of trust, but they forget to mention that this foundation is as fragile as glass. Once cracked, no amount of glue or careful repair can ever truly hide the scars. The lines of fracture will always remain, forever reflecting a distorted, broken version of what once was. In the quiet, sun-drenched suburbs of Austin, Texas, in a house that smelled of freshly cut grass and Sunday morning pancakes, that foundation was about to be pulverized into dust. The peace of that morning was shattered not by a storm, but by a single, piercing scream. It was a sound of pure violation, sharp enough to make the birds outside fall silent. The scream came from Jessica, a woman who curated her life with the precision of an artist, ensuring every detail was perfect. She stood frozen before the heavy steel door of the safe, nestled discreetly in the wall of her husband's home office. The door was wide open. Inside, the space that had, just yesterday, held their dreams for their 10-year-old son, Leo, was now a cavern of cold, empty air. $50,000, the entire college fund meticulously saved and nurtured, had vanished. Her husband, David, came running, his face pale with a confusion that was quickly turning to dread. He saw the empty safe, then looked at his wife's face, which was a mask of theatrical devastation. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but a careful observer might have noticed something else in her eyes, something beyond the panic. It was a flicker of cold, calculated precision, a glint of an opportunity seized. David wrapped an arm around her, trying to offer comfort, his mind racing through impossible scenarios. A break-in? But all the doors and windows were locked. An inside job? The thought was too monstrous to even form completely. Before he could speak, before he could ask a single question, Jessica slowly lifted her head. Her gaze drifted past him, through the office doorway, and into the living room. There, sitting quietly in her favorite armchair with a book resting in her lap, was his mother, Eleanor. She was a gentle, unassuming widow who had lived with them for the past 2 years, a silent presence in the house. Jessica's grief-stricken expression hardened almost imperceptibly, and as David followed her gaze, she finally spoke, her voice a venomous whisper that cut through the silence, laying the first crack in the glass. "Mother, you took it, didn't you?" To understand the depth of that accusation, you must first understand the delicate, fractured ecosystem of the family it was meant to destroy. From the outside, the home of David and Jessica Powell was a picture of suburban success, a carefully composed portrait of the American dream. David was a successful structural engineer, a man of quiet intelligence and steady hands, the kind of man who provided a stable, comfortable life. Jessica was his beautiful, effervescent wife, a stay-at-home mother who chaired the PTA's fundraising committee and whose organic garden was the envy of the neighborhood. Their son, Leo, was bright and happy, excelling in both his classes and on the soccer field. And then there was Eleanor, David's mother, the quiet matriarch who completed the picture of a multi-generational, loving family. But like any masterfully composed portrait, the truth was not in the overall image, but hidden in the brushstrokes, in the shadows behind the smiling eyes. Jessica, at 35, was a creature of ambition. She had not married David simply for love. She had married him for his trajectory. She saw in him a launching pad to a life she felt she deserved, a life featured in glossy magazines and envied on social media. She played the part of the perfect wife and mother flawlessly, but it was a role, a performance. Every perfectly plated dinner, every impeccably planned playdate was an investment in an image. Underneath the surface of Lululemon, activewear and effortless charm was a simmering resentment. Their comfortable, upper-middle-class life felt like a cage to her. It was good, but it wasn't great. It was secure, but it wasn't spectacular. And Eleanor, in her quiet, unassuming way, was a constant, living reminder of a simpler, more frugal world that Jessica was desperately trying to outrun. She saw her mother-in-law not as family, but as a relic, a piece of outdated furniture that clashed with the sleek, minimalist aesthetic of the life she was trying to build. Eleanor's gentle suggestions, her stories of the past, her very presence felt like an anchor holding Jessica back from the glittering future she so desperately craved. Eleanor, at 68, was the antithesis of her daughter-in-law. She was a woman carved from a different, older wood, one that valued substance over style. A widow for 3 years, her world had shrunk after her husband, Frank, had passed, but it had also deepened. Her happiness was not found in external validation, but in the small, tangible moments of life, the smell of bread baking in the oven, the warmth of the sun on her back as she tended her small patch of tomato plants, and most of all, the sound of her grandson, Leo's laughter. She had watched Jessica's arrival into her son's life with a quiet, maternal hope, a hope that had slowly been weathered down by years of subtle slights and passive-aggressive comments. Jessica was never openly cruel, for that would have been too crude for her polished persona. Instead, her weapons were words wrapped in velvet. "Oh, Eleanor, nobody makes pot roast like you do. It's so traditional." Or, "Leo, Grandma's stories are wonderful, but let's focus on your coding homework. That's what will get you ahead in the real world." Eleanor heard the unspoken meaning in every sentence, the constant dismissiveness. But for the sake of her son's happiness, for the fragile peace of his home, she absorbed it all. She became a master of silence, a quiet observer who held her tongue, believing her love for David and Leo was a strong enough shield against the chill emanating from her son's wife. Caught in the crossfire was David. At 38, he was a man stretched thin between the demands of his career and the delicate politics of his home. He loved his wife for the vibrant, orderly world she had created for him. He loved her energy, her social grace, the way she made their life seem so effortless and perfect. He loved his mother for being his anchor to the past, the source of his moral compass, the embodiment of unconditional love. And so, he chose to be blind. He wanted peace, and peace required ignoring the low-frequency hum of tension that always existed between the two most important women in his life. He interpreted Jessica's sharp-edged compliments as a generational difference in communication. He saw his mother's quiet withdrawal not as a sign of hurt, but as a natural slowing down that came with age. David lived in a state of willful denial, believing that if he didn't acknowledge the cracks in his family's foundation, they would simply cease to exist. And at the heart of it all was the money. The $50,000 in the safe was not just a sum, it was a testament, a legacy. It was the physical manifestation of a lifetime of hard work by Frank Powell, Eleanor's late husband. Frank had been a master mechanic, a man who believed in the honesty of calloused hands and the promise of a saved dollar. He wasn't a man of grand gestures, but of small, consistent acts of devotion. Every week for 40 years, he had taken a portion of his earnings, big or small, and tucked it away. It was the money from overtime shifts, from side jobs fixing neighbors' cars on weekends. It was money that could have been spent on newer cars or fancier vacations, but was instead consecrated to a future he might not even live to see, his grandson's education. When Frank died, Eleanor found the neatly stacked bills and savings bonds in his old toolbox. It was his final act of love. A month later, she presented it all to David and Jessica. Handing it over was more than a financial transaction. It was the ultimate act of faith. She was placing the fruits of her husband's life and her entire trust into their care, believing that the family they had built together was the safest place in the world. This was the family that stood in the quiet of that Sunday morning. It was a family built on a silent, unspoken pact. Jessica would perform perfection, Eleanor would perform contentment, and David would perform ignorance. But Jessica had grown tired of her role. The $50,000 wasn't just a solution to a secret, pressing problem she had hidden from her husband. It was an opportunity. By taking the money and blaming the one person she saw as an obstacle, she could solve her financial crisis and simultaneously excise the problem of Eleanor from her perfect life. Her accusation, therefore, was not an act of spontaneous panic. It was a carefully aimed torpedo, designed to sink the quiet, elderly woman who stood between her and the life she truly wanted. It was the opening salvo in the final battle of a war that, until that moment, had been fought entirely in the shadows. The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous, warping the comfortable Sunday morning atmosphere into something ugly and unrecognizable. For a long moment, no one moved. It was as if Jessica's accusation had been a spell, freezing them all in a tableau of domestic tragedy. The only sound was the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, each tick marking a second of a life that would never be the same again. From her armchair, Eleanor felt the accusation not as a sound, but as a physical impact, a punch to the gut that stole the air from her lungs. The worn pages of the book in her lap blurred. The room seemed to tilt, the world narrowing until the only thing she could see was the face of her daughter-in-law, a mask of calculated sorrow. The sheer monstrosity of the charge was so profound, so alien to the 68 years of her life, that her mind simply could not grasp it. It was like trying to imagine a new color, the concept of herself as a thief, as someone who could steal from her own grandson, was a puzzle her brain refused to assemble. Her husband Frank's face flashed in her memory, his proud smile the day he had taught a young David to ride a bike, his grease-stained hands carefully placing another bill into the savings can. The thought of desecrating that legacy was a violation so deep it made her feel nauseous. Then, the spell was broken. Jessica, the consummate actress, unleashed her performance. The cold precision in her eyes dissolved into a torrent of perfectly formed tears. She let out a sob, a wounded sound that was both heartbreaking and entirely false, and stumbled toward her husband, collapsing against his chest. David, still reeling from the initial shock, instinctively wrapped his arms around her, his expression a chaotic mix of horror and confusion. Jessica clung to him, her body trembling. "David," she choked out, her voice muffled against his shirt. "What are we going to do? It's all gone. Every penny. Leo's future, it's just gone." She pulled back just enough to look into his eyes, her face a masterpiece of despair. And then, she began to lay her trap. Not with the overt cruelty of an accuser, but with the subtle, devastating poison of feigned logic and reluctant concern. "Honey, you know I love your mother," she began, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You know I do, but we have to be realistic. We have to think this through." She took a ragged breath, as if the words themselves were painful to speak. "The doors were locked, the windows are secure. There was no break-in. The police would confirm that in a second. We both know that only 3 people in this entire world have the combination to that safe: you, me, and her." She let that final word hang in the air, letting its weight settle upon David. She didn't have to say, "I didn't do it," or "You didn't do it." The process of elimination did the work for her. This was her masterstroke. Seeing the conflict warring in her husband's eyes, the deep instinctual love for his mother fighting against the seemingly undeniable facts, Jessica pivoted to her most insidious tactic: the weaponization of age. She gently touched David's cheek, her expression shifting from one of a victim to one of a compassionate, heartbroken caregiver. "And David, sweetheart, we can't ignore it any longer. She's been so different lately, so forgetful." The words were soft, laced with a counterfeit pity. Just last week, she spent 20 minutes looking for her reading glasses while they were on top of her head. Remember that? And the week before, she put the carton of milk in the pantry instead of the refrigerator. We laughed about it then, but maybe it's not funny. Maybe it's something more. She let him process this, watching as she skillfully reframed normal, minor moments of absent-mindedness into a pattern of alarming cognitive decline. She was offering him an escape route, a way to doubt his mother without having to believe she was a monster. "I'm not saying she's a bad person," Jessica continued, her voice now barely audible, as if sharing a terrible secret. "Of course not. She's your mother. But what if? What if she got confused? What if she became worried that the money wasn't safe in there, and she decided to move it somewhere safer, and then she just forgot? Forgot that she did it, or forgot where she put it. Maybe she thought she was protecting it." It was a brilliant, cruel strategy. She wasn't accusing Eleanor of malice, but of infirmity. She wasn't calling her a criminal, but a patient. This narrative allowed David to feel not like a disloyal son, but like a concerned one, forced to confront a painful reality about his mother's health. The internal battle on David's face was agonizing to watch. Every fiber of his being, Every childhood memory of his mother's unwavering integrity screamed that this was impossible. This was the woman who had returned a wallet full of cash that she'd found in a grocery store. This was the woman who had taught him that a person's name was the only thing they truly owned, and it was only as good as their honesty. But then he looked at his weeping wife, the beautiful life she had built for him, and the seemingly logical, if heartbreaking, chain of evidence she had laid out. His mind, trained in engineering and logic, struggled to find a flaw in the terrible equation. Finally, he turned his gaze from his wife to his mother. He didn't look at her with anger or accusation. He looked at her with a desperate, pleading confusion. It was a look that said, "Please, Mom, please make this make sense. Give me another answer. Give me anything else." And for Eleanor, that single look, that flicker of doubt in her own son's eyes, was more painful than the accusation itself. The world could call her a thief, and she would stand tall. But to be questioned by her own child, the boy whose scraped knees she had bandaged and whose nightmares she had soothed, was a betrayal that shattered her heart. The shock receded, replaced by a cold, profound sorrow. But beneath the sorrow, a core of steel, long dormant, began to glow with heat. Jessica had mistaken her silence for weakness for far too long. Slowly, with a dignity that seemed to push back against the toxic atmosphere in the room, Eleanor rose from her armchair. The book slipped from her lap and landed softly on the carpet, but she didn't notice. She didn't look at Jessica. Her daughter-in-law had become irrelevant, a mere phantom of deceit. Her eyes were locked on her son. She saw the boy he had been and the conflicted man he had become. When she spoke, her voice was not loud or hysterical. It was quiet, freighted with the weight of a lifetime of love and the crushing pain of this single moment. "I have lived for 68 years, David," she said, her voice trembling almost imperceptibly. "I was Frank's wife for 45 of them. I am your mother. I am Leo's grandmother. In all of that time, in all of those roles, no one has ever had a single reason to question my word or my honor." She paused, letting the truth of her statement settle in the space between them. "I did not take the money." Her words were simple, absolute, and undeniable. They drew a line in the sand. On one side stood Eleanor and the truth. On the other stood Jessica and her intricate web of lies, with David standing lost and broken in the middle. Eleanor's denial, as firm and absolute as it was, did not clear the air. Instead, it acted like a chemical agent, solidifying the toxic suspicion into something hard and unbreachable. The terrible, vibrating silence that followed her words was the sound of a family breaking. David stood paralyzed between his wife and his mother, a man on a bridge that was collapsing from both ends. Jessica, seeing that her initial, direct assault had been met with a wall of dignified defiance, simply gave a small, defeated sigh, as if to say, "I tried." She took David by the hand and led him from the room, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the cavernous silence of the living room, the accusation still echoing in her ears. From that moment on, the Powell house ceased to be a home. It became a territory divided by a cold and bitter war, and Jessica was its merciless general. The days that followed were a masterclass in psychological cruelty. Jessica understood that she couldn't force Eleanor out of the house with a single, unproven accusation. David would never stand for that. So, she embarked on a campaign not to expel Eleanor physically, but to erase her from the fabric of their family life, to make her existence so unbearable that she would be forced to leave on her own accord. She built invisible walls, but they were as real and as cold as concrete. The first and most obvious wall was erected in the kitchen, the traditional heart of any home. The ritual of the family meal, once a noisy, happy affair filled with Leo's stories from school, died a sudden death. Jessica now cooked only enough for 3. She would move around the kitchen with a pointed efficiency, ignoring Eleanor completely, her movements crisp and hostile. If Eleanor attempted to cook for herself later, she would find that Jessica had just cleaned, the counters sterile and unwelcoming, a clear message that her presence was a contamination. The segregation spread throughout the house like a creeping frost. Laundry was now done in separate, distinct loads. Jessica would speak to David about Eleanor as if she weren't even in the room, her voice carrying a tone of strained patience one might use for a difficult child. "David," she'd say, while Eleanor sat reading just a few feet away, "could you please ask your mother if she plans on using the living room television tonight? I'd like to watch a movie with Leo without distractions." Every sentence was a small cut, every action designed to reinforce Eleanor's new status as an outsider, a burden, a problem to be managed. But Jessica's cruelest and most effective strategy was the wall she built between Eleanor and Leo. Their bond had always been Eleanor's greatest source of joy, a pure and uncomplicated love that served as a balm against the subtle chill from her daughter-in-law. Jessica knew this, and she targeted it with surgical precision. One afternoon, Leo, bursting with excitement over a drawing of a spaceship he had made, ran toward his grandmother to show her. "Grandma, look, it has laser cannons," he shouted with glee. Before he could reach her, Jessica intercepted him, swooping in with a bright, false smile. "Oh, sweetie, that's amazing. Let's show it to Daddy when he gets home," she said, gently steering him away. She glanced at Eleanor over her shoulder, her eyes cold. "Let's give Grandma some quiet time. Her mind is very tired lately, and we don't want to confuse her." To a 10-year-old boy, the words were confusing but authoritative. To Eleanor, they were a dagger to the heart. She was being recategorized in her grandson's mind, shifted from beloved grandmother to a fragile, pitiable figure who needed to be handled with care, or worse, avoided entirely. David, meanwhile, floundered in the miserable new reality of his home. He hated the suffocating silence, the separate meals, the way his wife and mother orbited each other like hostile planets. He was a man who craved peace, and the absence of it was a constant, grinding stress. He tried to be a mediator, but his attempts were clumsy, poisoned by the doubt Jessica had so skillfully planted. One evening, he found his mother sitting alone in her room, the lights dim. He entered, his posture a portrait of anxious pleading. "Mom, we can't go on like this," he began, his voice strained. "The whole house feels like it's holding its breath. Jessica is a wreck. She's barely sleeping." Eleanor simply looked at him, her silence, an invitation for him to say what he really meant. He faltered, then pushed on, his words revealing the true nature of his concern. Are you absolutely certain you didn't just decide to put the money somewhere safer? Maybe a safety deposit box you opened and forgot about? Or maybe it's tucked away in one of your old cedar chests upstairs?" He saw the flicker of pain in her eyes and rushed to soften the blow, but only made it worse. "It's okay if you did, Mom. Really, we all get forgetful. Your memory, well, it's not what it once was, and that's perfectly normal. Nobody's blaming you. We just need to find the money. If you could just try to retrace your steps from that day for me." The words crushed Eleanor. He was not on a quest for the truth. He was on a quest for a resolution. Any resolution that would placate his wife and restore the peace in his house. He was gently, lovingly, asking her to accept the role of the confused, senile old woman to solve his marital problems. He was asking her to sacrifice her own integrity for his comfort. The chasm between them widened into an impassable canyon. She realized then that her son was lost to her, adrift in the fog of Jessica's influence. Her isolation was now complete. The house that had been her home, filled with memories of raising her son and of her life with Frank, now felt like a beautifully decorated prison. Every room held a new kind of pain. The kitchen was a place of exclusion. The living room, a stage for her daily humiliation. Even her own bedroom felt less like a sanctuary and more like a cell. But the deepest ache came from the forced distance from Leo. She would hear his laughter from the other side of a closed door, and her heart would physically hurt. She'd see him playing in the backyard from her window, a small, vibrant figure in a world she was no longer allowed to fully enter. Jessica had successfully severed her from her two greatest loves, her son's trust and her grandson's presence. Sitting there in the dim light of her room, stripped of her dignity, her role, and her family, Eleanor felt a profound and terrifying loneliness. She had hit the bottom. There was no one coming to vindicate her. David, her beloved son, would continue to plead with her to confess to a crime of senility she did not commit. Jessica would continue her relentless campaign until Eleanor was nothing more than a ghost haunting the hallways of her own home. She could either fade away, accepting the pathetic role they had assigned her, or she could fight. For 68 years, she had been a creature of peace and quiet endurance. But as the saying goes, do not mistake silence for weakness. In the chilling solitude of that room, a new feeling began to stir within Eleanor's heart, displacing the sorrow. It was a cold, hard, unfamiliar feeling, but she recognized it instantly. It was resolve. Jessica had built walls to imprison her, but she had made a critical mistake. She had given her quiet, forgotten mother-in-law nothing left to lose. And a person with nothing left to lose is a person who can do anything. For 2 more days, Eleanor endured. She moved through the house like a ghost, a specter of a life that was no longer hers. She ate her simple meals in the quiet of her room, the silence, a poor substitute for the lively dinner conversations she missed so dearly. She watched from her window as Leo played in the yard, her heart aching with a love that had no outlet. The despair was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making each breath a conscious effort. She felt herself shrinking, fading, becoming the frail, confused woman Jessica accused her of being. And then, something shifted. It wasn't a sudden explosion of anger, but a quiet, cold hardening in the deepest part of her soul. It was the realization that grieving for the family she had lost was a luxury she could not afford. The family was gone. All that was left was the truth, and a woman who was being systematically destroyed by a lie. Her mind, which Jessica had so cruelly and publicly maligned as being foggy and unreliable, began to work with a desperate, diamond-hard clarity. She wasn't senile, she was besieged. She wasn't forgetful. She was wounded. But she was not broken. She began to replay the last few months in her mind, not with the soft focus of memory, but with the sharp eye of an investigator looking for a clue, for a weapon, for anything. She cataloged every slight from Jessica, every moment of her son's willful blindness. She re-examined the layout of the house, the routines of its inhabitants. She was searching for a crack in the fortress of lies Jessica had built. The memory surfaced on a Tuesday afternoon, triggered by something as mundane as the flash of a red light. She was looking out the living room window when a delivery truck stopped across the street. On the driver's dashboard, a small, blinking red light from a dashcam caught her eye. And just like that, a forgotten conversation from 4 months prior came rushing back. There had been a string of minor burglaries in the neighborhood, packages stolen from porches, a car broken into down the street. David, ever the pragmatist, had come home one evening with a small, sleek black box. "Just for peace of mind, Mom," he had said, holding it up. "It connects to the Wi-Fi, records everything. I can check it from my phone anytime." He had installed it on a high shelf in the living room, nestled between a stack of art books and a framed photo of Leo. And then, as the neighborhood scare faded, everyone had forgotten about it. Everyone. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Her heart began to beat with a force that was no longer just sorrow, but a wild, surging hope. The camera. It was positioned to cover the front door, but the wide-angle lens also took in a perfect, unobstructed view of the hallway that led to David's office, and a clear line of sight to the office door itself. It had seen everything. It was the only impartial witness in this entire, ugly affair. It was her silent, electronic advocate. She felt a jolt of energy, a purpose that had been absent for what felt like an eternity. She waited until Jessica was on a long conference call in her home office, her voice a low, professional murmur behind the closed door. Eleanor moved from her armchair into the center of the living room. Her gaze traveled up the bookshelf. And there it was, a tiny, black, circular lens, no bigger than a dime. It was so discreet, so perfectly blended into the shadows of the shelf that it was nearly invisible. It was an unblinking eye, a digital ghost that had been silently recording the life and the lies of the Powell family. It had been watching. But then, the crushing reality of the situation set in. Hope was one thing, access was another. The camera was a black box to her. She had no idea what brand it was, how it stored its recordings, or what app was needed to view them. All of that information was on David's phone, locked behind his password and his loyalty to his wife. Asking him for help was impossible. The moment she mentioned the camera, he would tell Jessica, and Jessica, clever and ruthless, would find a way to erase the footage, to destroy the one piece of evidence that could save her. For a moment, the despair threatened to return. To be so close to the truth, to have it sitting right there on a shelf, and to be unable to reach it, was a special kind of torture. She retreated to her room, her mind racing. She needed help. She needed someone with the right skills, but more importantly, someone she could trust without question. Her family was small, and her circle of friends had dwindled over the years. But then, a name came to her, a beacon of light in the fog. Mark, her sister's son. Mark was a brilliant young man in his late 20s, a software engineer for a tech startup in Dallas. He was the one who had patiently set up her first tablet, the one who had never made her feel foolish for asking basic questions about email or the internet. He loved his Aunt Eleanor, and he was far enough removed from the immediate family drama to be a safe harbor. The decision was made. Now came the execution. This, she knew, had to be handled with the cunning of a spy. Jessica was preternaturally aware of everything that happened in the house. A secretive phone call was a risk. Eleanor had to plan it. She knew Jessica attended a hot yoga class every Wednesday morning from 10 until 11:30. It was a sacred ritual she never missed. That was her window. On Wednesday morning, Eleanor watched the clock, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. At 9:55, she heard Jessica's car pull out of the driveway. The house fell silent. Eleanor took a deep breath, walked to her room, and gently closed the door. Her hands were still shaking as she picked up her phone and dialed Mark's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm and familiar. "Aunt Eleanor, what a nice surprise. Everything okay?" She forced a cheerful, slightly dotty tone into her voice, playing into the very stereotype Jessica was using against her. "Oh, Mark dear, everything is fine. I'm just losing my mind with this new technology," she said with a light laugh. "Listen, I know how terribly busy you are, but I was wondering if I could impose on you for a huge favor. David is so stressed with work, and I feel just awful bothering him with this." "Of course, Auntie. Anything. What's up?" "Well, it's this tablet he got me. I swear it has a mind of its own, and our home Wi-Fi seems to drop out in my room all the time. I was thinking, if you happen to be in the Austin area anytime soon, maybe you could pop by and take a look for your technologically hopeless old aunt." It was a believable, mundane request. Mark chuckled. "No problem at all. I can actually drive down this weekend. How's Saturday?" Eleanor's heart leaped. "Oh, that would be just wonderful, dear." Then, she added the crucial piece, her voice casual, almost an afterthought. "And you know, while you're here, there's one more silly little thing. David installed one of those little security cameras a while back, and he showed me once how to look at it on his phone, but I can't for the life of me remember how. Maybe you could show me how to get it on my tablet? I just think, being here alone sometimes, it would make me feel a bit safer to be able to see the front door." The lie was perfect. It was not the request of a woman seeking exonerating evidence. It was the request of an aging widow seeking a small measure of security. "That's a great idea, Aunt Eleanor. Super easy. We'll get you all set up," Mark promised. After they hung up, Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed, the phone still clutched in her hand. A single tear rolled down her cheek, but it was not a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of profound, earth-shaking relief. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she was not just reacting, not just absorbing pain. She had taken a step. She had reached out from her island of isolation and thrown a line to the outside world. The silent, unblinking eye on the bookshelf was no longer just a piece of technology. It was a promise. It was a potential judge and jury. It was a single, brilliant ray of light in the suffocating darkness, and she was now just days away from finding out if it had seen enough to bring the dawn. While Eleanor was quietly forging her alliance with the future, Jessica was frantically trying to outrun the past. If Eleanor's world had become a prison of quiet isolation, Jessica's was a gilded cage, and the walls were closing in with terrifying speed. To the outside world, and even to her husband, she maintained the facade of a grieving, stressed, but resilient victim. She still dressed impeccably, her makeup was flawless, and her voice on the phone with other PTA mothers was as bright and cheerful as ever. But in the stolen moments of privacy, when the mask came off, a different woman emerged, one who was haunted, hunted, and breathtakingly desperate. Her sanctuary was her walk-in closet, a meticulously organized space lined with designer shoes and handbags that smelled of expensive leather and faint perfume. Here, amidst the trappings of the success she projected, she would wage her secret war. The enemy was an ever-dwindling bank balance and a series of increasingly threatening phone calls from a number she had saved under a false name. One afternoon, locked inside this shrine to her ambition, she took one such call. Her voice, usually so confident, was reduced to a panicked, placating whisper. "No, please, just listen," she pleaded, her back pressed against the cold wall. "I told you I would have it. I have it. It's just complicated to move that amount of cash without raising flags." The voice on the other end was an angry, masculine buzz, inaudible but menacing. Jessica flinched. "I am not playing games with you," she hissed, her whisper turning venomous. "You'll get your money. You will get every last cent. Just give me until the end of the week. That's all I need. A few more days." She ended the call and squeezed her eyes shut, her knuckles white as she gripped her $1,000 smartphone. The life she had so carefully constructed was a house of cards built on a fault line, and the tremors were getting stronger. After the call, she would sink into her plush office chair, the picture of a modern, successful woman, and pull up her secret credit card statements on her laptop. The numbers were a bloodbath of red, balances that were 5 figures deep, interest charges that compounded with merciless speed. The life she was living was not their life. It was a life she was leasing from banks, 1 month at a time, and the lease was about to expire. The $50,000 from the safe had been a temporary reprieve, a plug in a dam that was already showing a dozen other cracks. It wasn't enough. The pressure was still on. And so, she began to liquidate her world, piece by painful piece. She started with the things David was less likely to notice: a pair of earrings, a designer coat she rarely wore. She sold them on consignment websites, the process humiliatingly slow, the returns insultingly small. But it wasn't enough. The threats from her mysterious caller grew more urgent. She needed a larger sum, and she needed it now. Her eyes fell upon the diamond tennis bracelet David had given her for their 5th anniversary. It was her favorite piece, a glittering symbol of the life she had thought she was securing. Selling it felt like a betrayal, not of him, but of her own ambition. But fear was a more powerful motivator than sentiment. The next day, she drove to a jewelry exchange in a different part of the city, a place of harsh fluorescent lights and quiet desperation. She handed the bracelet over to a man with tired eyes who weighed it, tested it, and offered her less than 1/3 of its value. She took the cash without haggling, the crisp bills feeling both like a salvation and a surrender. That night, David noticed its absence on her wrist. "Honey, you're not wearing your bracelet," he said casually as they cleared the dinner table. Jessica didn't miss a beat. She produced a calm, enlightened smile. "Oh, that. I sold it," she said, her tone breezy. David stopped, a plate in his hand. "You what? Why? You loved that bracelet." "I did," she conceded. "But I've been doing a lot of reading lately about minimalism, about the art of letting go, all this stuff. It doesn't bring happiness, David. It's just weight. I'm trying to simplify, to clear out the clutter, you know. It feels freeing." She framed the act of desperation as one of spiritual growth, a narrative so perfectly aligned with modern self-help culture that it was nearly impossible to question without sounding materialistic and unenlightened. David, a man who dealt in the concrete certainties of physics and engineering, was baffled by this, but he accepted it. He was too tired to argue. He mistook her frantic house cleaning and organizational sprees not as signs of a mind in turmoil, but as extensions of this new minimalist philosophy. But other cracks were appearing that were harder to explain away. The call came during dinner a few nights later. It was a credit card company, calling about a platinum card in Jessica's name with an alarming overdue balance. David had answered the phone. As the automated voice droned on, his brow furrowed in confusion. "I think there's been a mistake," he said into the receiver. "We don't have an account with your bank." Jessica lunged across the table and snatched the phone from his hand, her face a brief, ugly flash of pure panic before she smoothed it over with a mask of annoyance. "Ugh, telemarketers," she snapped, ending the call. "That wasn't a telemarketer, Jess. They said there was a past due balance on one of your cards." "It's ridiculous," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "It must be identity theft. You hear about it all the time. Don't worry, I'll sort it out tomorrow. Honestly, with all the stress of this situation with your mother, my head is spinning. I can't even think straight." In one swift move, she had deflected the issue, invented a plausible explanation, and subtly blamed the entire incident on the stress caused by Eleanor. Her own precarious situation made her campaign against her mother-in-law all the more urgent. Eleanor had to go, and soon. Jessica needed a scapegoat for the tension that was now suffocating their home, and she needed to force the endgame before her own world imploded. Her methods became more brazen. One morning, she took Eleanor's reading glasses from the nightstand and tucked them inside the freezer behind a bag of frozen peas. An hour later, she initiated a house-wide search for them, ending in a triumphant, sorrowful discovery. She presented the frosted glasses to David that evening. "I found them in the freezer, David," she said, her voice trembling with manufactured concern. "The freezer. What if she leaves the stove on next? What if she walks out the front door and gets lost? I love her, but she is becoming a danger to herself. And what about Leo? It's not safe. This isn't a home for her anymore. It's a hazard. We need to start looking at professional facilities, places where she can be properly cared for and kept safe." David was crumbling. He was a man drowning in problems he couldn't solve. His wife, normally the unflappable captain of their domestic ship, seemed to be unraveling before his eyes. He saw her selling cherished possessions and believed it was a bizarre response to stress. He accepted the story of identity theft because the alternative that his wife was hiding a secret financial life from him was unthinkable. Now, Jessica's arguments about his mother's safety were beginning to sound less like a cruel plot and more like a responsible, albeit heartbreaking, conclusion. The thought of peace, of returning to a home not defined by silent warfare, was becoming an irresistible siren song. The idea of moving his mother into a care facility began to shift in his mind from a betrayal to a sad necessity. That night, Jessica lay in bed, staring into the darkness. The cash from the bracelet was a temporary balm on her raging financial inferno. It would quiet her demons for a few more days. She could feel David's resistance wearing down, his arguments against moving his mother becoming weaker, more tired. She felt the giddy, nauseating thrill of a gambler on a losing streak who suddenly sees a winning hand. She was so close. She just had to hold the mask in place a little longer, play the victim a little more convincingly. She was so focused on the endgame ahead of her, so consumed by the fires at her back, that she never once glanced at the tiny black, unblinking eye on the bookshelf downstairs. She had no idea that a silent witness had recorded her every move, and that her quiet, forgotten mother-in-law was just waiting for the arrival of the one person who could give that witness a voice. The following Saturday arrived, not with a storm, but with the quiet hum of a well-maintained sedan pulling into the driveway. Mark's arrival felt like the first breath of fresh, clean air in a house that had been sealed shut for weeks. He was a wave of normalcy in a sea of dysfunction, carrying a backpack with his laptop and a warm, genuine smile for the aunt he adored. But from the moment he stepped over the threshold, his smile faltered. He was an expert in reading code and diagnosing network errors, but one didn't need any special training to read the atmosphere inside the Powell house. It was heavy, oppressive, and thick with unspoken grievances. Jessica's welcome was a prime example of her artistry. Her smile was bright and wide, but it didn't reach her eyes, which were cold and appraising. "Mark, what a long drive." "It's so sweet of you to come all this way for Eleanor's little computer troubles," she said, her tone implying that both the troubles and Eleanor were incredibly trivial. David emerged from his office, looking weary and distracted, and gave Mark a brief, tired handshake before retreating back to his work. And then there was his aunt. Mark saw that Eleanor looked smaller than he remembered, more fragile, but as she hugged him, he felt a surprising strength in her grip and saw a glint of fierce determination in her eyes that he had never seen before. He was here to fix a tablet, but he knew instantly that he had walked into the middle of a war. The first hour was a carefully staged performance for Jessica's benefit. They sat in the living room, in full view, with the offending tablet between them. Mark, playing his part to perfection, tapped at the screen with a serious expression, asking Eleanor loud, technical-sounding questions about software updates and cache clearing. Eleanor, a surprisingly adept actress, played the part of a befuddled but grateful senior, nodding along and asking for clarification. All the while, Jessica hovered. She tidied up things that were already tidy. She fluffed pillows that were already plump, her movements a restless orbit around them. Her suspicion was a palpable force. "Are you sure you can't just call one of those geek services, Mark?" she asked, her voice dripping with false concern. "We'd be happy to pay for it. I'd hate for you to waste your whole weekend on this." "It's no trouble at all, Jessica," Mark replied easily, not looking up from the tablet. "Anything for family." Finally, after an hour of this tense charade, Mark delivered the line they had planned. He stood up and stretched. "You know, Aunt Eleanor, I think the Wi-Fi signal is really weakest in your room. The router is on the other side of the house. I should probably work on it in there to see if I can boost the connection." This was their escape. They retreated down the hall to Eleanor's bedroom, and the quiet click of the door closing behind them felt as momentous as the locking of a bank vault. They were in. They were safe. The moment the door was shut, the performance ended. The tension drained from Eleanor's shoulders, replaced by a profound weariness. Mark turned to her, his easy smile gone, his expression now serious and concerned. "Okay, Aunt Eleanor," he said softly. "The tablet is working perfectly, and your Wi-Fi signal is as strong as it's going to get. Tell me what's really going on. Tell me why you look like you haven't slept in a month." And so she did. In a low, pained voice that sometimes cracked with emotion, she told him everything. She told him about the missing money, Frank's legacy for his grandson. She told him about Jessica's instant, venomous accusation and the cruel, insidious narrative she had spun about her failing mind. And, most painfully of all, she told him about the look of doubt in her own son's eyes. As Mark listened, his easygoing demeanor evaporated, replaced by a cold, protective anger. He had always known Jessica was materialistic and a bit of a snob, but this was a level of cruelty he couldn't have imagined. "She won't get away with this," he said, his voice a low growl of pure conviction. "She won't." He immediately set up his laptop on Eleanor's small writing desk. The sleek, modern machine, a stark contrast to the room's gentle, old-fashioned decor. He didn't need the camera's password from David. His expertise ran deeper than that. "Most of these home security devices have back doors, if you know where to look," he explained quietly, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "As long as it's on the house Wi-Fi, I can find it on the network, and from there, I can get to the cloud storage where the recordings are kept." Eleanor watched, mesmerized, as lines of code scrolled across the screen. To her, it was an impenetrable language, but she understood its purpose. It was the language of truth. After a few tense minutes of typing, a login portal for the camera's manufacturer appeared on the screen. A few more clicks, and then it happened. A grid of video thumbnails populated the display, each one a small, silent window into the recent past. A wave of relief and terror washed over Eleanor. The ghost was in the machine. Now, they just had to see what it had witnessed. The investigation was a slow, agonizing process. The camera recorded in short, motion-activated clips. The timeline was a vast, sprawling digital tapestry of the mundane. Clip after clip showed nothing of consequence. The sun would rise, casting long shadows across the living room floor. Jessica would walk past, dressed for yoga. The cat would chase a dust bunny. Leo would run through the frame, a blur of youthful energy. David would leave for work and return hours later, his shoulders slumped with fatigue. Each clip was a small burst of hope, followed by a small disappointment. As the hours crawled by, a seed of doubt began to sprout in Eleanor's heart. What if the crucial moments had happened just out of frame? What if the camera had malfunctioned? What if Jessica had somehow known about it and disabled it? She watched the endless loop of her own captured life, her own lonely comings and goings, a sad, silent figure in the background of her family's home, and the weight of it all began to feel unbearable. Mark seemed to sense her fading hope. He reached over and gently squeezed her hand. "We'll find it, Auntie," he said, his focus never leaving the screen. Patience. She was arrogant. She was so sure that nobody was watching. People like that make mistakes. Once, their work was interrupted by a sharp rap on the door. "Mark? Eleanor?" It was Jessica's voice, sharp and suspicious. "Are you two okay in there? I'm about to make some lunch." Mark minimized the video portal in a flash, pulling up a diagnostic screen full of meaningless charts. "We're good, Jessica," he called out, his voice cheerful and casual. "Making some good progress. We'll be out in a bit." They heard her footsteps retreat down the hall, and they both let out a breath they hadn't realized they were holding. They continued their digital archaeology, moving backwards in time. They scrolled past Saturday, past the miserable day of the accusation. They scrolled past Friday and Thursday. The sheer volume of data was disorienting. They were now deep into Wednesday, the day before everything had imploded. Eleanor's eyes were burning from staring at the screen. Her hope had dwindled to a tiny, flickering ember. Maybe Mark was wrong. Maybe there was nothing to find. Just as she was about to suggest they take a break, Mark suddenly stiffened. He leaned closer to the laptop, his eyes narrowed. "Wait," he whispered, his voice sharp with focus. He pointed a finger at the screen, at a single file nested among hundreds of others. The timestamp was late Tuesday afternoon, around 4 p.m. It was just another motion-activated clip, no different from the rest. "What's this?" He clicked on it. The file opened, and the living room filled the screen, bathed in the warm golden light of the late afternoon. For a second, nothing happened. Then, a figure entered the frame from the left, moving not towards the front door, but towards David's office. It was his mother. It was Eleanor. The investigation was over. The revelation was about to begin. The small, pixelated image on the laptop screen held both Eleanor and Mark in a state of suspended animation. The air in the room grew thin, electric, with a mixture of dread and hope. It was an out-of-body experience for Eleanor, watching a version of herself from a life that felt a lifetime ago, a version of herself from before the accusation, before the fracture. This woman on the screen, this ghost of her recent past, moved with a quiet purpose that now, in the context of the last 2 weeks, felt unbearably suspenseful. She was the protagonist in a silent film, and only the two people in this room knew what she stood accused of. On the screen, the ghost of Eleanor moved with a gentle, almost hesitant gait. As she approached the door to David's office, she glanced over her shoulder, down the empty hallway. At the time, it had been a simple, unconscious gesture to ensure her act of private generosity would remain just that private. But now, filtered through the lens of suspicion, the gesture looked furtive. It looked guilty. Mark, sitting beside her, drew in a sharp breath. His hand tightened on the laptop, his knuckles turning white. For one heart-stopping, terrible moment, a sliver of doubt, a dark seed planted by Jessica's lies, tried to take root in his mind. What if she was just checking to see if anyone was watching? The Eleanor on the screen disappeared into the office. The camera, fixed in its position, could not follow her. It could only stare at the empty doorway. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Eleanor, the real Eleanor, felt her own heart pounding against her ribs. She knew what she had done that day, but seeing it play out like this, knowing how it could be twisted and misinterpreted, was a unique form of torture. Then, the figure reappeared. She had left the office door slightly ajar. She knelt down, her body momentarily obscuring the camera's view of the safe. They could hear the faint, metallic clicks as she turned the combination dial, a sound that in her memory was one of loving duty, but now sounded like the tumblers of a lock in a prison cell. She swung the heavy safe door open, and the camera's view was perfect. It was as if David had installed it for this very purpose, an unknowing instrument of future justice. The contents of the safe were clear, neat, thick stacks of $100 bills. Frank's legacy, Leo's future. Mark leaned in so close his nose was nearly touching the screen. This was the moment, the fulcrum on which everything balanced. The on-screen Eleanor reached into the pocket of her sensible knit cardigan. Time seemed to slow down. Her hand emerged, but it wasn't empty, preparing to take. It was full. It was holding a thick, plain white envelope. With emotion that was almost reverent, she leaned forward. She didn't pull a single bill out of the safe. Instead, she gently, carefully placed the white envelope on top of the largest stack of cash. She patted it once, a gesture of finality and love, a silent message to her grandson years in the future. Then she closed the heavy door, spun the dial with a decisive whirl, rose to her feet, and walked back down the hallway, disappearing from the frame. The clip ended. The screen returned to the grid of video files. For a full minute, the only sound in the room was the soft whir of the laptop's fan. Mark stared at the screen, his mind struggling to reconcile the scene he had just witnessed with the story of theft his aunt had told him. He slowly turned to look at Eleanor, his eyes wide with a dawning, heartbreaking understanding. His voice, when he finally spoke, was barely a whisper. "Aunt Eleanor." What was that? What was in the envelope? Eleanor finally allowed the tears she had held back for 2 weeks to fall. They weren't the theatrical, sobbing tears of Jessica. They were silent, heavy tears of profound sorrow and vindication. "It was for Leo," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It was from his grandpa and me." She began to explain, and with her words, she painted a picture of the quiet, selfless love that Jessica's greed had so brutally defiled. She told Mark about a night, a month or so earlier, when she had woken up needing a glass of water. As she passed the living room, she'd heard David and Jessica talking, their voices low and worried. They thought she was asleep. They were discussing a news segment they had seen about the astronomical rise in college tuition costs. $50,000, which had seemed like a fortune when Frank had saved it, was no longer a guarantee of a debt-free education. "I just don't know how we'll make up the difference, David," Jessica had said, her voice tight, with a stress that Eleanor at the time had believed was genuine parental concern. Hearing that, Eleanor had felt a pang of duty. Frank's gift was meant to be a promise kept, a future secured. She didn't have much. Her widow's pension was just enough to live on without being a burden. But she had a few treasures from her long life with Frank, tucked away in an old jewelry box. The next day, she had taken a quiet bus ride to a part of town she didn't frequent, to a small, reputable jeweler. In her purse was a small velvet pouch containing her late husband's gold wedding band. It was the ring she had placed on his finger 45 years earlier, the ring he had worn every single day until the day he died. Since his passing, she had kept it with her own, a silent testament to a love that death could not end. "I sold it, Mark," she confessed, her voice breaking. "And a few other small things. That ring. It was just sitting in a box. Frank would have wanted it to be used for the boy. I know he would have." The money from the sale, combined with over 6 months of her pension that she had painstakingly saved by cutting back on every possible expense, amounted to just over $5,000. It was everything she had in the world. She had put it all in the envelope. "I didn't want a big fuss," she explained, wiping a tear from her cheek. "I didn't want Jessica to feel like I was interfering, or for David to feel obligated. It was a gift from his grandparents to their grandson. That's all. I wanted it to be a surprise, something they would discover years from now when they went to use the fund. A little extra love from the past." Mark was speechless. He felt a wave of emotion so intense it almost made him dizzy, a fierce, protective love for this quiet, incredible woman, and a white-hot, furious hatred for Jessica. "You did that?" he finally managed to say, his own voice thick. You sold Grandpa Frank's ring to add to Leo's future, and that woman, she accused you of stealing from it? The sheer, cosmic injustice of it was staggering. It was beyond a simple lie. It was a sacrilege. It was a perversion of one of the most beautiful, selfless acts he had ever heard of. He reached out and took his aunt's hand, his grip firm and grounding. "I am so sorry, Auntie," he said. "I am so sorry this happened to you." They sat together in the quiet room, the profound truth of what they had just seen settling over them. The video was more than just proof of Eleanor's innocence. It was a testament to her character. She had been accused of the exact opposite of her actions. She had been painted as a thief for an act of pure generosity. The first revelation was complete, and it was devastatingly sad. Her name was cleared, at least in this room, but the knowledge of her sacrifice and the cruel betrayal that had been her reward left a bitter taste in its wake. The joy of vindication was muted by the sorrow of it all. Mark looked back at the screen, his expression hardening. They had found the evidence that exonerated the saint. Now, he thought, his fingers moving back to the mousepad, it was time to find the evidence that would condemn the sinner. The emotional aftershock of the first revelation left a heavy silence in Eleanor's small room. The image of her own selfless act, captured in grainy color, was a painful testament to a love that had been met with the ugliest of betrayals. For a moment, Eleanor felt a wave of pure, unadulterated sorrow wash over her. But Mark did not allow them to linger in that pain. The sadness in his eyes had been replaced by a cold, hard fire. The mission was only half complete. They had proven his aunt's innocence to themselves. Now, they had to unmask the guilty. "We keep going," he said, his voice quiet but firm. His fingers were already moving, clicking forward through the timeline. They moved past Tuesday afternoon and into the evening. The on-screen sun set, and the living room in the video clips was plunged into a blue twilight gloom. The rhythm of the house continued its normal, deceptive pace. David came home from work. They saw the family moving in the periphery, the muffled, silent drama of their separate evening routines playing out. Every time Jessica's form flitted across the screen, a new tension filled the air. She was no longer just a character in their domestic play. She was the primary suspect in a crime they were watching unfold in reverse. They clicked through the hours, 8 p.m., 9 p.m., 10 p.m. The clips became less frequent as the house settled down for the night. The lights in the digital living room went out one by one until the only illumination came from a single, faint nightlight near the base of the stairs, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. The screen was now mostly black, punctuated by brief flashes of movement as the cat prowled the silent house. It felt ghoulish, like watching a place that was haunted, which, in a way, it was haunted by lies, by greed, and by the imminent commission of a crime. They passed midnight and moved into the dead of Wednesday morning. The timestamps on the files grew further and further apart. 1 a.m., 1:30 a.m. The house was asleep. Eleanor's eyes were burning, and a deep weariness had settled into her bones. The emotional roller coaster of the past hour had been exhausting, but Mark was relentless, his focus absolute. He was a hunter, and he could sense that he was closing in on his prey. And then he saw it. A single, isolated file. The timestamp read 2:17 a.m. Well, Mark murmured, his voice a low growl. "Look what we have here. Who's taking a stroll at 2 in the morning?" His cursor hovered over the thumbnail for a beat, a moment of pure, dramatic suspense. Then he clicked. The screen filled with the dark, grainy image of the living room, illuminated only by the ghostly glow of the nightlight. For a few seconds, it was perfectly still. Then, a figure emerged from the deep shadow of the hallway. It moved with a furtive quickness, a stark contrast to the gentle, deliberate movements of Eleanor in the previous video. The figure was wrapped in a silk robe, a garment of luxury that seemed out of place in the predatory darkness. As the person drew closer to the office, the faint light caught the side of a pale, anxious face. It was Jessica. Her hair was a mess, and her face, stripped of its daytime mask of makeup and confident smiles, was a canvas of raw anxiety. She was barefoot, and she moved with a practiced silence, a thief in her own home. She kept glancing back over her shoulder, her eyes wide and darting, listening for any sound that might betray her. She reached the office and, like Eleanor, knelt before the safe. But there was no reverence in her posture. It was the desperate crouch of a cornered animal. Her hands, which in the daylight arranged flowers and signed permission slips, now trembled as they worked the combination dial. She fumbled it once, twice, a small curse escaping her lips, too faint for the camera's microphone to pick up but visible in the tense set of her jaw. Finally, a soft click. The heavy door swung open. And then, the true nature of her character was laid bare. There was no hesitation. There was no moment of reflection or regret. Her hands, adorned with a perfectly manicured set of nails, darted into the safe like vipers. They did not select or count. They simply took. She scooped up the thick stacks of $100 bills, her movements fast, efficient, and ugly. Her eyes then fell on the plain white envelope Eleanor had placed there just 10 hours earlier. For a fraction of a second, she paused. A flicker of something curiosity, surprise, crossed her face. Then, with a shrug of utter indifference, she snatched that too. She had no idea of the sacrifice it contained. To her, it was just more. She had brought a prop for her crime, a large, ostentatious handbag from a famous French designer, one that David had often complained had cost more than their first car. The irony was grotesque. She began stuffing the cash and the envelope into the bag, the symbol of her aspirational greed, now literally filled with the proceeds of her betrayal. She crammed it all in, zipped the bag shut, and swung it over her shoulder. With one last, guilty look around the silent room, she pushed the safe door closed, gave the dial a careless spin, and scurried back into the darkness of the hallway, vanishing as quickly as she had appeared. The clip played on for another 10 seconds, showing nothing but an empty room and the faint glow of the nightlight. Then it ended. The truth, in all its sordid, undeniable detail, was now sitting on the laptop on Eleanor's writing desk. The silence in the room was absolute, a vacuum left in the wake of the crime they had just witnessed. Mark slowly leaned back in his chair, his body rigid with a fury that was so profound it had gone past heat and turned to ice. "There it is," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any triumph, caught, red-handed. He looked at his aunt, and his heart broke for her. He had found the proof, but in doing so, he had forced her to watch the complete moral disintegration of her son's wife. Without another word, he began the methodical process of saving the video file to a secure flash drive. He made 2 copies. He was now the custodian of Jessica's doom. Eleanor did not cry this time. The emotion she felt was too deep, too complex for tears. It wasn't shock. On some intuitive level, she had known. The sheer viciousness of Jessica's accusation had been a confession in itself, an act of preemptive attack from a guilty conscience. But knowing something in your soul and seeing it with your own eyes are 2 different things. To witness the frantic, greedy movements, the casual theft of her own heartfelt sacrifice, the utter lack of any morality, it was like watching a surgeon confirm a terminal diagnosis. The last, lingering shred of hope she had foolishly held for her son's marriage, for the integrity of the mother of her grandchild, died a final, quiet death. Her overriding emotion was not anger at Jessica, but a deep, cavernous sorrow for David. He was the true victim in all of this, a good, hard-working man who had been so completely and utterly deceived. This truth would not just set her free, it would shatter her son. The 2 of them, the quiet matriarch and her loyal nephew, sat before the glowing screen, the keepers of a terrible secret. They now possessed a weapon of absolute power. The question was no longer what had happened, or who was to blame. The only question left was how to deploy the truth for maximum impact, to ensure that the justice served would be as profound and as unforgettable as the betrayal itself. The 2 video clips, damning and definitive, played again in the silent room, looping on Mark's laptop screen. The first, a testament to a quiet, selfless love. The second, a portrait of frantic, bottomless greed. They were 2 sides of the same coin, a story of sacrifice and sacrilege. Mark's hands were clenched into tight fists, his entire body radiating a furious, protective energy. He was ready for war. "That's it," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "It's over. We're going downstairs right now. We'll plug this laptop into the television and show David. We'll watch the smirk get wiped right off her face." He made a move to stand up, his righteous anger propelling him toward an immediate, explosive confrontation. But Eleanor, with a calm that was both shocking and absolute, reached out and placed a hand on his arm. "No," she said. Her voice was soft, but it carried an undeniable weight, a core of tempered steel that stopped him cold. "We will not be doing that." Mark turned to her, his expression a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "Aunt Eleanor, what are you talking about?" "We have her. It's undeniable. It's proof." "It is proof to us," Eleanor corrected gently, her eyes fixed on the image of Jessica on the screen, stuffing cash into her designer bag. "But if we go down there now, in anger, what do you think will happen? She will not confess. People like her never confess. She will scream. She will cry those perfect crocodile tears. She will say the video is a fake, a fabrication. She will turn to David and accuse you, a tech expert, of doctoring the footage to frame her and protect me." She looked at Mark, her gaze sharp and intelligent. "She will invent 100 different lies in 100 seconds. She will say she was sleepwalking. She will say she thought she heard a burglar and was moving the money to a safer place. She will create a storm of chaos and confusion, and in that storm, she will paint herself as the victim, again. And David." Her voice softened with a profound sadness. "My son is a good man, but he is a tired man. He wants peace. He is desperate to believe in the woman he married. She will use that against him, against the truth. It will become a war of words, and in that war, she will wound everyone." A new, chilling resolve had settled over Eleanor. The woman who had endured weeks of silent humiliation was gone, replaced by a clear-eyed strategist. Her suffering had not just wounded her, it had forged her. "No," she repeated, her voice dropping lower. "This will not be a messy, chaotic storm. This will be a surgical procedure. The truth will not be argued over. It will be presented. It will be revealed in a way that allows for no defense, no escape, and no doubt whatsoever. Her lies must be dismantled in front of an audience she cannot manipulate." An idea, cold and brilliant, began to form in her mind. It was a plan that would use Jessica's own arrogance and sense of superiority as the instrument of her undoing. "She believes she has won," Eleanor murmured, more to herself than to Mark. "She thinks I am a broken, senile old woman ready to be put out to pasture. We will let her believe that. In fact, we will encourage it." She turned to Mark, her plan now fully formed. "I need you to do 2 things for me. First, put those video files on a simple USB drive that can be plugged into the television. Second, you must be here on Sunday evening. Can you do that?" "Of course, Auntie," Mark said, his anger now tempered by a growing awe for his aunt's quiet cunning. "But why Sunday?" "Because on Sunday," Eleanor said, a faint, grim smile touching her lips for the first time in weeks, "we are going to have a family dinner." The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Eleanor waited until later that afternoon, when she knew David would be on his lunch break. She called his cell phone, carefully pitching her voice to sound weary, fragile, and utterly defeated. "David, my dear," she began, letting a slight tremor enter her words. "I've been doing a lot of thinking. This situation in the house. It isn't fair to anyone. It isn't fair to you, or to Jessica, or to little Leo. I can't bear to be the cause of so much unhappiness." "Mom, don't say that," David started, his voice full of the familiar, exhausted guilt. "No, let me finish, son," she insisted gently. "I am old. Perhaps Jessica is right. Perhaps my mind is not as sharp as it once was. I am ready. I am ready to accept whatever decision is best for the family. I am ready to discuss my future." She could hear the audible sigh of relief on the other end of the line. She had him. Now, for the hook. "But a decision this big," she continued, "it shouldn't be made lightly. I think we should do this properly, as a family. I was hoping we could invite Jessica's parents to join us for dinner on Sunday evening. I value their wisdom, and if I am to leave my home, I would like the chance to say goodbye to them properly. It seems like the right thing to do. The framing was perfect. To David, this was an act of noble surrender, a mother's final, heartbreaking sacrifice for the peace of her son's family. He saw it as a gesture of grace, a way to bring this awful chapter to a close with some semblance of dignity. "Of course, Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Of course. That's a very brave and generous idea. I'll talk to Jessica. We'll arrange everything." When David relayed the news to Jessica that evening, her reaction was one of pure, unadulterated triumph. She listened, her face a mask of somber sympathy, but inside, her heart was singing. It worked, she thought, a giddy sense of victory surging through her. "I broke her. She's finally given up." The request to include her own parents was, in her mind, the icing on the cake. It was perfect. They would now be present to witness her victory firsthand. They would see how she had navigated this difficult situation with such grace and patience. They would see her husband's problematic mother finally being dealt with, leaving their perfect daughter to her perfect life. She wrapped her arms around David's neck, feigning a sad magnanimity. "Oh, David, the poor thing. Of course, that's the least we can do. It's the right thing to do for everyone. It will be a difficult evening, but it's for the best." And so, the trap was set. The invitations were made, and they were accepted. The stage was being prepared for a final Sunday supper. For the next few days, an unnatural calm settled over the Powell house. Jessica was magnanimous in her victory, walking on air, her guard completely down. She was kinder to Eleanor, speaking to her with a condescending pity that was almost worse than her previous hostility. David, relieved that an end was in sight, moved with a lighter step. Only Eleanor and Mark, who communicated via discreet text messages, knew the truth. Eleanor continued her quiet routine, but a transformation had occurred. The silence she now wore was not the silence of a victim. It was the deep, patient, and watchful silence of a predator, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The storm was planned, and on Sunday evening it would finally make landfall, right in the heart of the Powell family living room. The air in the Powell home on Sunday evening was thick enough to be carved with a knife. Jessica, playing the role of the magnanimous victor, had orchestrated the entire affair to be a showcase of her impeccable taste and compassionate nature. The dining table was set with their finest china, the silver gleamed under the soft light of the chandelier, and a lavishly prepared roast beef sat as the centerpiece. It was a scene of domestic perfection, a carefully constructed stage for the final act of a long-running play. Jessica's parents, Bill and Mary, arrived looking exactly as one might expect, proud, polished, and entirely convinced of their daughter's sainthood. They greeted Eleanor with a gentle, pitying sympathy that made her skin crawl, patting her hand and telling her how brave she was. They were not malicious people. They were simply blinded by a parental adoration that saw their daughter only as the successful, gracious woman she pretended to be. Mark was the last to arrive, his expression neutral, his presence a quiet anchor of support that only Eleanor understood. He was introduced simply as the helpful nephew who was in town for the weekend, and he faded into the background, an unassuming variable in Jessica's carefully planned equation. The dinner was an exercise in masterful manipulation. Jessica steered the conversation with the skill of a seasoned diplomat, never mentioning the stolen money directly, but circling it constantly. She spoke in broad, philosophical terms about the challenges of aging, the pain of seeing a loved one change, and the difficult choices families have to make out of love. "Mom, Eleanor has just been so tired lately," she said to her own mother, her voice a perfect blend of concern and sorrow. "It's been heartbreaking to watch. We just want her to be safe and comfortable." Bill and Mary nodded along, their faces etched with sympathy for their daughter's burden. "You are a saint, Jessica," Mary said, reaching across the table to squeeze her daughter's hand. "Truly, not every woman would handle such a trying situation with so much grace." David, caught in the undertow of the collective narrative, was a study in discomfort. He ate little, spoke less, and agreed with his wife in monosyllables. He wanted this evening to be over. He saw it as a necessary amputation, a painful but required step to save the larger body of his family from the gangrene of conflict. Eleanor, for her part, was a statue of quiet composure. She ate a few bites, pushed the food around her plate, and listened. She listened to the false praise, to the carefully coded language of her exile, and she let them all believe her silence was the sad resignation of the defeated. Her calm was so absolute, so unnerving, that it was mistaken for fragility. Only Mark, who occasionally met her gaze from across the table, could see the cold, hard resolve shimmering beneath the surface. After the plates were cleared, Jessica stood, clapping her hands together with an air of gentle finality. "Why don't we all move to the living room for some coffee and dessert?" she suggested, her smile radiating a warmth that didn't reach her eyes. And then, "I believe there is something important we all need to discuss together, as a family." This was the signal. This was the moment the trap would be sprung, or so she thought. They settled into the living room, arranging themselves in a tableau of family crisis. Jessica and David took the main sofa, a deliberate projection of a united front. Bill and Mary sat opposite them in armchairs, their expressions somber and supportive, ready to act as witnesses to their daughter's painful but necessary decision. Eleanor and Mark took seats slightly off to the side, near the large, dark screen of the smart television, two quiet satellites to the central drama. David, looking down at his hands, cleared his throat. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind a dozen times, and still the words felt like shards of glass in his mouth. "First," he began, his voice strained, "I want to thank you all for being here. Bill, Mary. It means a lot to us. This island, incredibly difficult. As most of you know, we've had a very trying time in our home these last couple of weeks. There's been a lot of stress and confusion, and it's become clear that we can't continue on as we have been." He took a deep breath, steeling himself to deliver the final blow. "For the well-being of everyone, but especially for Mom's own safety and peace of mind, Jessica and I have been forced to consider, David." The word, spoken softly but with the clear, commanding ring of a bell, cut through his sentence. Everyone turned. Eleanor was looking at her son, not with defiance, but with a strange, sad authority. She held up a single hand. "Forgive me for interrupting you," she said, her voice impossibly calm in the tense room. "You are right. This has been a trying time. And a decision does need to be made tonight about the future of this family." She paused, letting her words sink in, her gaze sweeping over the confused faces in the room. Jessica's gracious smile had tightened into a thin, wary line. This was not following her script. Eleanor continued, her voice gaining strength. "But before any decisions are made, and before any more words are spoken, I believe it is essential that everyone in this room understands the full and complete truth of what has happened here. Words can be twisted, memories can be called into question. So, rather than tell you, I've decided it would be much simpler to just show you." With a grace that seemed to defy the very situation she was in, Eleanor stood up. Mark, on cue, reached into his jacket pocket and discreetly passed her a small black USB flash drive. It seemed impossibly small to hold the power that it did. A flicker of genuine alarm finally entered Jessica's eyes. "Mother, what is this?" she snapped, her voice losing its gentle facade and taking on a sharper edge. "What are you doing? This isn't the time for silly games." Eleanor ignored her completely. She walked with a steady, deliberate pace to the large television mounted on the wall. Her back was to the room, but everyone could feel the monumental shift in power that was occurring. She located the USB port on the side of the television. The small, sharp click as the drive slid into place was the loudest sound the room had ever known. It sounded like a key turning in a lock, or a bolt sliding into place. She turned back to face them, the television remote now in her hand. She looked at each person, one by one. She saw the confusion on the faces of Bill and Mary. She saw the deep, agonizing conflict in the eyes of her son. And finally, she looked at Jessica, and for the first time, she saw not a confident manipulator, but a cornered, frightened woman whose mask was beginning to crack. "I'm told this is what you call a home movie," Eleanor said, her voice even and clear, resonating in the dead silence. "I find the term fitting." Because it is a film about what truly happens inside the walls of this home, when people believe no one is watching. With her thumb, she pressed the play button. The dark screen flickered and then lit up, bathing the stunned faces of the family in its cold, blue light. The first image to appear was the silent, unblinking view of their own living room, as seen from the eye of the forgotten camera on the shelf. The final performance had just begun. The cold, blue light of the television screen washed over the silent, stunned faces in the living room. On the screen, the first video began to play. It was a silent movie, yet it screamed with truth. They watched as Eleanor, the woman they had all gathered to gently exile, walked to the safe, her movements filled with a quiet, secret love. They saw her place the white envelope inside, an act of pure, unadulterated generosity. A wave of confused murmurs rippled through the room. Jessica's mother, Mary, looked from the screen to Eleanor, a frown of bewilderment on her face. David let out a soft, choked gasp, a sound of dawning shame and horror as he began to understand the scene he was witnessing. Jessica herself went rigid, the color draining from her face. She recognized the day, the cardigan Eleanor was wearing, the envelope. This was not the movie she had been expecting. But there was no time to process the revelation of Eleanor's sacrifice. Before anyone could speak, the screen went black for a second, and then a new scene began. The timestamp in the corner now read 2:17 a.m. The room was dark, grainy, haunted. And then Jessica appeared. The collective gasp in the room was sharp and audible. Mary's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. Her husband Bill's face, moments before filled with paternal pride, began to turn a dark, mottled red of pure fury and shame. They watched, in horrified silence, as the woman on the screen, their daughter, their wife, moved like a thief in the night. They watched her frantic, greedy hands empty the safe. They watched her snatch the very envelope Eleanor had so lovingly placed there. They watched her stuff her spoils into a handbag that cost more than a month's mortgage and scurry away into the darkness. The video ended. The television screen went black, but its reflection still showed the frozen, horrified faces of its audience. The silence that descended was not empty. It was dense and heavy, filled with a truth so ugly it had sucked all the air from the room. And then the silence was shattered. Jessica, her entire body trembling, leaped to her feet. "It's fake!" she shrieked, her voice high and shrill with panic. "It's a lie! Mark, you did this. You're some kind of computer whiz. You doctored it to protect her. David, you can't believe this." But her words were hollow, her defense pathetic against the cold, hard evidence they had all just witnessed. David didn't even look at her. He was staring at the blank screen, but his gaze was turned inward, replaying the last few weeks, the last few years, seeing it all now through a new, brutally clear lens. He slowly recoiled from her on the sofa, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but it was a gesture of total and complete rejection. Seeing she had lost him, Jessica collapsed to the floor in a heap of silken tears, her final, desperate gambit ready on her lips. "All right, yes, I took it," she sobbed, crawling on her knees towards David. "But I was going to pay it back, I swear. I had no choice. A man, a loan shark, he was threatening me. He said if I didn't get him the money, he would hurt Leo. He would hurt our son. I did it to protect our family. I did it to protect him." It was a masterful lie, a final, venomous appeal to the heart of any parent. For a moment, her parents looked at her with a flicker of desperate hope, wanting to believe any explanation, no matter how wild. But David did not move. He did not look down at his weeping, pleading wife. When he finally spoke, his voice was alien. It was flat, calm, and utterly devoid of any emotion he had ever shown her before. It was the voice of a man whose heart had been surgically removed without anesthesia. "The private investigator I hired found no gambling debts, Jessica," he said to the room at large, as if she were no longer there. The words landed like stones in the silent room. "A private investigator?" Her father, Bill, whispered. "Yes," David continued, his voice as dead as his eyes. "The credit card calls, selling her anniversary bracelet for minimalism. It didn't make sense. My mind is logical. It looks for patterns. And the pattern was one of desperation and deceit. He finally turned his head and looked down at the woman on the floor, not with anger, but with a cold, clinical curiosity, as if studying an unfamiliar and disgusting insect. He didn't find loan sharks, Jessica. He found wire transfers. Regular, monthly transfers for the last 3 years to an account belonging to your ex-boyfriend. The one you told me had died in a car crash. A collective gasp went through the room. It turns out he's very much alive. And according to the investigator's report, he was blackmailing you, not over a debt, over the hit and run you were both involved in, back in college. The one you covered up. The one that left a man in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. The final, ugly truth was out. The money for their son's future had not been stolen to protect him. It had been stolen to silence a past crime, to pay for a secret life, and to fund the man she had been with before him. The betrayal was not a single crack in the foundation. The entire foundation was a lie. It was over. There were no more tears, no more denials from Jessica. She just knelt on the floor, broken and exposed. Her mother, Mary, began to sob, a sound of pure, maternal shame. Her father stood up, his face a mask of stone. "Don't call us," he said to his daughter on the floor. "Don't ever call us again." He took his weeping wife by the arm, and they walked out of the house and out of her life. David waited until the front door had closed. He stood up and looked down at Jessica one last time. "A lawyer will be in contact with your new address in the morning," he said, his voice a flat monotone. "I want you to pack a bag and be out of this house tonight. You will not see Leo. You will not speak to him, not until a judge forces me to let you." And with that, he turned and walked out of the room, heading upstairs to his son, leaving Jessica completely and utterly alone in the wreckage of the perfect world she had built. Weeks later, a new kind of quiet settled in the house. It was not the tense, heavy silence of before, but a clean, peaceful one. David was slowly healing, held together by the unwavering, gentle love of his mother, their bond reforged in the fires of truth, and now stronger than ever. Eleanor was a grandmother again, free to bake cookies with Leo, to read him his grandfather's stories, to love him without fear or mediation. The scars remained, deep and permanent, but the poison had been drained away. And in the end, the story of the Powell family became a testament to a simple, powerful truth. Never underestimate the silence of a person who has endured for too long. For when they finally choose to speak, their voice is not merely a sound, it is a force of nature, a storm that can level a world built on lies. Thank you for listening. Justice can be a long and winding road, but sometimes it finds its destination in the most unexpected ways. We will see you again for the next story.